The stone walls of Buon fortress rose 40 feet from the Nubian desert, watchtowers scanning horizons where Egyptian power met resistance. Inside, 300 soldiers maintained Rome's southern frontier, isolated for years without leave, without families, without connection to the lives they once knew. And within those walls existed a punishment so deliberate in its cruelty that Egyptian scribes rarely recorded it directly. They called it simply given to the soldiers. This was not execution, it was not slavery. It was something the legal codes described in language so vague that modern scholars debated its meaning for decades before accepting the uncomfortable truth. The vagueness was intentional. What happened in those frontier garrisons was designed to be unspeakable. To understand this punishment, we must first understand the machine that created it. Ancient Egypt's legal system had evolved over 2,000 years into a sophisticated bureaucracy that documented everything: property transfers, tax assessments, criminal proceedings. The Egyptians believed in Mat, the cosmic principle of order and justice, and they structured their society to maintain this balance. But Mat did not mean fairness, it meant stability. And stability required making examples of those who threatened it. The punishment structure was graduated according to offense and status. Minor crimes brought beatings or forced labor. Serious crimes warranted mutilation, ears, noses, or hands removed as permanent marks of transgression. The copper mines of the Sinai represented a slower death sentence, where convicts rarely survived 2 years in conditions so brutal that assignment there was considered worse than execution. The most severe crimes against state or religion brought immediate death by impalement, burning, or being thrown to crocodiles. But certain crimes occupied a peculiar middle ground. Cases where a man of status was convicted, but his wife was also implicated through association. Cases where powerful individuals wanted punishment that would be memorable without the expense and ritual complications of execution. Cases where someone needed to disappear from respectable society while technically remaining alive. For these situations, the practice of giving existed. The system originated in military necessity. Egypt's frontier garrisons faced a specific problem. Soldiers stationed at remote fortresses like Buon, Elephantine, or Semna served for years without rotation. They were isolated from their communities, from marriage, from the social structures that normally channeled behavior. Left without any acceptable outlets, these men became restless, violent, prone to disorder that threatened military effectiveness. The solution was pragmatic in the way military solutions often are. Certain women criminals, prisoners of war, occasionally slaves who had seriously offended their owners were assigned to garrison use. They belonged to no individual soldier. They were communal resources, maintained by garrison command, available to any man who wanted access. This served multiple functions simultaneously. It provided an outlet that reduced tensions among soldiers. It created a punishment worse than death while avoiding the religious complications of execution. It made examples of women whose crimes, or whose husbands' crimes, required visible consequences without requiring visible bodies. The women who were given occupied a legal status unlike anything else in Egyptian society. They were not slaves, because slaves had owners who bore legal responsibility for them. They were not prisoners, because prisoners served specific terms and then gained release. They were not property in the conventional sense, because property could be bought, sold, inherited, and legally protected. The legal terminology that survives in Egyptian documents is remarkably consistent. They were given. The word suggests transfer, suggests something has changed hands, but specifies neither recipient nor purpose. Everyone knew what it meant. No one wanted to state it directly. Evidence for this practice comes from multiple sources. Papyrus records from the New Kingdom reference women given to the garrison as punishment for crimes ranging from theft to adultery to political offenses involving their husbands. Archaeological evidence from frontier fortresses shows separate quarters distinct from both barracks and slave housing. Administrative documents track resources allocated for communal women, separate from military provisions or slave maintenance. The punishment was reserved almost exclusively for women of at least modest status. Peasant women or slaves who committed crimes faced simpler punishments, beatings, mutilation, or sale. But women who had known comfort, who had held position, who came from families of scribes, priests, or minor officials, these women could be given as a way of demonstrating that status provided no protection once the legal system marked someone for destruction. The sentence carried no fixed term. Women remained garrison property until released by official petition or until death. Release required someone with influence to advocate on their behalf, and few families wanted to acknowledge that a female relative had endured years in a frontier garrison. Most women did not survive long enough for release to matter. Understanding what given to the soldiers meant in practice requires examining the archaeological and documentary evidence from Egypt's frontier garrisons with unflinching honesty while maintaining scholarly distance. Bowen, one of the largest Nubian fortresses, housed approximately 300 soldiers during the New Kingdom period. Archaeological surveys have identified a small structure near the western wall, separate from both barracks and slave quarters, with features suggesting it housed multiple women. Communal sleeping areas, a separate latrine system, and access controlled by garrison command rather than individual soldiers. Administrative papyri tracking garrison resources occasionally reference provisions for women of communal use, rations, clothing, and medical supplies allocated separately from both military provisions and slave maintenance. These records are clinical, bureaucratic, documenting resources without describing purposes, but the mathematics are inescapable. Evidence suggests ratios of approximately 3 to 5 women for garrisons of 200 to 300 soldiers. What this meant in practical terms is something the Egyptian sources avoid describing directly. Modern historians, cross-referencing archaeological evidence, administrative records, and occasional references in legal documents, have reconstructed a system that was both brutal and bureaucratic. Women assigned to garrisons were maintained by military command as shared resources. They had no legal right to refuse access by any soldier, from commanders to lowest-ranking conscripts. They could not leave garrison grounds without escort. They had no ability to petition for different treatment or to appeal their sentences. They existed in a legal void where they were simultaneously controlled by everyone and protected by no one. Survival rates were catastrophic. Of the limited records that track individual women, evidence suggests average survival periods of 18 to 24 months. Some died from disease, the same fevers, infections, and parasites that killed soldiers. Some died from injuries. Some died from causes the records describe only as exhaustion or failure. The few who survived long enough to be released present their own troubling historical puzzle. Legal documents occasionally reference women returned from garrison service in contexts suggesting they struggled to reintegrate into Egyptian society. Some entered temple service, performing menial labor in religious institutions that asked few questions about their pasts. Some disappeared entirely from the documentary record, their fates unknown. None, in the surviving sources, ever married or bore legitimate children after release. One of the most detailed surviving accounts comes from a letter written during the late 18th dynasty by a priest named Amenemhat. He wrote to a colleague about his sister, who had been given to the garrison at Elephantine after her husband was convicted of temple theft. Amenemhat described attempting to petition for her release after 2 years, only to be informed she had died 6 months earlier. The garrison command had not considered it necessary to notify her family. She had not been family. She had been garrison property, and her death required no more documentation than the breaking of any other piece of equipment. Scholarly debate about this punishment centers not on whether it existed, the evidence is too consistent, but on how widespread it was and whether it continued throughout Egyptian history. Some historians argue it was relatively rare, reserved for particularly serious cases. Others suggest it was more common than sources indicate, with many cases simply not recorded because they involved women of insufficient status to warrant documentation. What is clear is that by the Ptolemaic period, references to this punishment become increasingly rare. This may reflect changing legal practices, different attitudes toward women's status, or simply better survival of other types of records. The practice appears to have ended entirely under Roman administration, which imposed different legal structures on Egypt. The silence surrounding this punishment in popular discussions of ancient Egypt is itself historically significant. Modern narratives about Egyptian civilization focus on pyramids, pharaohs' art, and architecture, the aspects of the culture that suggest sophistication and achievement. The treatment of women who fell outside social protection receives far less attention, not because evidence is lacking, but because it complicates comfortable narratives about ancient wisdom and justice. The women who were given to the soldiers left almost no direct testimony. Their voices were filtered through male scribes who had their own reasons for recording or concealing information. What survives are administrative traces, resource allocations, occasional legal references, archaeological evidence of spaces designed for purposes no one wanted to describe directly. This was not random cruelty. This was a method of destroying personhood while technically leaving bodies alive. It was punishment refined over centuries, documented in euphemisms, designed to be effective precisely because it was unspeakable. Ancient Egypt built monuments that still inspire wonder 3,000 years later, but those monuments were built by a civilization that could also create punishments so deliberately cruel that even its own scribes preferred not to record them clearly. Both realities are part of the historical record. Both deserve acknowledgement.